Welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. I'm Emily MacArthur.
And I'm Kaylin Nicholson. Mental health is a nationwide crisis, especially for young people. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have found that nearly 20% of high school students, that's 1 in 5, report serious thoughts about suicide, and 9%, or nearly 1 in 10, report a suicide attempt. The rates are even higher for high school girls, queer teens, and Native youth, with some of the most alarming increases occurring among Black youth. Suicide is now the second leading cause of death among people aged 15 to 24 in the United States. Emergency room healthcare workers across the country report being completely overwhelmed by the deluge of young people showing up in acute mental health crisis, a result not only of the rapid growth in the proportion of young people struggling with their mental health, but also the abysmal lack of funding for support services available for them to access to avert a full-blown crisis. This spiral of youth mental health crisis has gone hand in hand with a frightening increase in gun violence affecting young people. Since 2017, gun violence has become the leading cause of death among people under 25. The rate of youth firearm-related deaths as a whole has nearly doubled since 2014, with a major increase since the start of the COVID pandemic. Here in Seattle, where On Strike is filmed, young people are facing both of these crises, mental health and gun violence, and some young people have been getting organized to demand action. Before we continue, I want to remind you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. If you've been watching On Strike, you know that we bring coverage, political analysis, and strategy for the working class of the kind you simply won't find in the mainstream media. Become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to build our movement against the bosses and their political servants, and so that On Strike can continue to bring the kind of discussions about strategy needed to fight back and win. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people. Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. Also, we need to mobilize for mass protests at the DNC in August. Be sure to register for the July 21st Workers Strike Back National Zoom meeting, where we'll be preparing for these protests and getting more organized to take the movement forward over the next few months and beyond. Despite the dramatic mental health crisis among young people, less than a third of schools around the country provide mental health services of any kind. Even in schools that do provide mental health counseling, it's severely under-resourced. The American School Counselor Association recommends a minimum of 1 counselor for every 250 students. Shockingly, even here in Seattle, with all its wealthy corporations and billionaires, there's currently only 1 therapist for every 1,300 students in public schools.
Which is just mind-blowing. And this is coming at the same time as we've got just recognized impacts that COVID had on everybody's mental health, but especially on young people. And also when we see things like gun violence in the schools, which has impacted Seattle area schools directly. And then on top of that, things like climate change, an economy that is not offering opportunities for huge sections of young people. All this comes together to create a situation where mental health, crisis in schools is acute.
At Lincoln, we have maybe 5 main counselors at our school that support 1,600 students. So you can just imagine how overworked they are, including in mix with how overworked students are and how burnt out students are on a daily basis. There's just not enough support at our school for all of our students in the student body. I talk to students every day at my school. I talk to my friends every day, and they're just always so stressed, and they feel like they can't get the support they need. They feel overworked, and so, we're really fighting, and we're urging for this change in mental health counseling.
And at the same time, we have just a complete lack of attention being given by Democrats on the Seattle City Council or Democrats in the state legislature who run the whole thing. Just not funding the kinds of programs, the kinds of needs that students have.
Despite this dire situation, Seattle's corporate Democratic Mayor Bruce Harrell and City Council are refusing to hire social workers and mental health counselors for Seattle's public school students. What's more shameful is that they are refusing, even though students, teachers, and socialists fought alongside then City Council member Kshama Sawant and won a $20 million annual increase last year to our historic Amazon tax in order to fund this urgent need for our young people. Harrell and the Democratic Party are refusing to fund these programs even though the money is already there as a result of this victory. As many of our viewers know, Shyama was on the Seattle City Council for 10 years and is a co-founder of Workers Strike Back and a co-host of this broadcast. Among the many historic victories that Shyama's office won alongside socialists and working people was the Amazon tax in 2020, which raises over $214 million every year to fund affordable housing and other services by taxing the city's wealthiest corporations. Both Emily and I were also a part of the struggle to win the Amazon tax, as was most of our on-strike team, including our co-producer Calvin Priest and our correspondent and research associate M. Smith. The $20 million addition to the Amazon tax that students, union members, and socialists won last year was part of the annual People's Budget campaign that was launched by Shyama during her first year in office in 2014 and organized every year after that to build movements to win concrete gains for working and oppressed people.
Just a few weeks ago, 17-year-old Garfield High School student Amarr Murphy-Paine was tragically gunned down outside Garfield High School during the school lunch hour, another victim of the gun violence epidemic. Seattle's Democratic Party political establishment and their mouthpieces, like the Seattle Times, have been cynically trying to exploit this latest school shooting by insisting that cops need to be brought back into schools. We know that cops in schools won't stop gun violence. A study published in June last year in the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management evaluated federal data from 2014 to 2018 and found that cops in schools don't prevent shootings. The study found that the presence of cops does, quote, increase the use of suspension, expulsion, arrests, and referrals to police, and particularly for Black students, boys, and students with disabilities, end quote. Young people need social and mental health support, affordable and high-quality housing, and free health care for all, and fully funded public schools, not cops. And yet, for the last half year, the Democrats and the Seattle City Council have refused to use the $20 million from Amazon and other wealthy corporations, which our movement won, to hire counselors and mental health therapists. Students, union members, and socialists are fighting back. On Strike spoke to Seattle High School student activists Natalia, Charlotte, and Fatra. We also spoke to Adam Zimkowski, socialist and member of Workers Strike Back, and a rank-and-file member of the Seattle Educators Union. Adam also worked in Shyama's office for 10 years and helped lead many of the struggles undertaken by our Socialist Council office, including winning the Amazon tax itself and then winning the $20 million annually to fund student mental health needs.
We made it clear that it wasn't enough to win that funding there. What that really does is the city council allocates the money, but then the mayor still has to spend it. And we've seen with many examples that oftentimes, frankly, we've seen this with homeless, funding for building homeless shelters and things like that the money will just sit there unspent. And the way that money is going to get spent in full is going to be by a continued organization and pressure by students like the Seattle Student Union, but then also together with the educators, with the Seattle Educators Association, the organized labor, and with community members.
He's giving us crumbs, expecting us to take it, to try to shut us up, and we're not going to take it. We're going to continue to fight until we have all 20 million.
Our experience shows that it will take a fight in order to force Seattle's Democratic Party establishment to concede and actually use the $20 million to fund the mental health support for public school students that it was originally intended for.
Both Charlotte and I have been working on an email campaign along with other students where it's just a template email. It already has the pre-filled addresses of Mayor Harrell and a couple other people that work in his office, and then has a message that we've already written and drafted, and people can just click on that link in our Instagram bio and click send. If you could just do that right now, it takes 2 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, an email can be a very good kind of first, start to getting people organized and kind of reaching out to as many people as possible and figuring out like who does want to get involved, who is willing to sign a petition. But then, it is important to move, beyond the electronic world, beyond the emails, to organizing rallies and actions. There's an election later this year. Bruce Harrell is undoubtedly going to be out doing campaign events, doing events around the city, having students there to demand that he release all of the 20 million could be a powerful thing. Because ultimately, yeah, what we do need to do is organize ordinary people, young people, teachers, to not just kind of in email, but in the real world, pressure Democrats when the votes are being taken, both on the council, but also by ordinary people in elections, to make it clear that they'll pay a price if they don't do what students and working people want.
It took a fighting movement to win the $20 million in the first place. If you're watching this, you can help right now by taking a few minutes to send the email to Seattle's Democratic establishment. You can find the link at Seattle Student Union on Instagram. We'll also include this information in the episode description. The email campaign is one part of the overall movement-based approach that's needed to build pressure on the political establishment.
After the Ingram High School shooting, students across the district were scared. We never thought that there would be a shooting in our own district. That seemed like something in red states in the South where they did not have proper gun control. But then we realized there isn't an assault weapons ban in our state. So we began organizing both for mental health counselors in our schools and then statewide for an assault weapons ban. We organized a protest at Seattle City Hall calling for both, a demand on the city but also demand on the state. And then we ramped up the pressure. We continued to organize students to fight and advocate on the state level for an assault weapons ban. And then we led a youth day of action at the Capitol. We bussed students down, 100 students, to lobby legislatures and then also just have a press conference and rally for this statewide assault weapons ban. We are also very proud to have worked with numerous other groups who are fighting for this. It was only possible because so many people came together united. You really cannot win anything alone, but because we had lots of students, thousands of students fighting for this, along with other people, other movements fighting for an assault weapons ban, we were able to challenge politicians and the governor and the legislature, which is led entirely by Democrats. After the Ingram High School shooting, we won $4.5 million for school mental health counselors. But in working with the city to implement that money, we realized that was not enough money to support every student across the district. So we organized in this November, the last budget season, to push for even more money because students across the district are struggling and need that money. And then we led a petition and we encouraged lots of people to email and call in to city officials on the Seattle City Council to tell them to vote for our amendment to tax Amazon and fund $20 million for school mental health counselors. Lots of students went to public comment. We sat for hours until the very, very end of it, once it had gotten dark outside.
Seeing a mega corporation like Amazon tripling their profits while my friends are overdosing, killing themselves, and killing each other is a slap in the face. I demand that all Democrats support Councilmember Sawan's budget amendments to increase the Amazon tax to finance mental health and SPS.
And in the end, we barely won. 4 to 5 council members voted for this amendment, but still that's a win. And it's one of the biggest wins of this budget season, if not the biggest.
And this is especially significant because it wasn't, just money that came from anywhere. It came from the Amazon tax, right? So the richest corporations in this city. And I wonder, if you could talk a bit more about that specific fight and what are some key lessons that, maybe students could be applying today.
I mean, that was one of those struggles where we were told right at the start, you gotta play by the rules, you gotta be responsible. Don't say tax Amazon because it'll just poke the bear that you don't wanna poke. And we rejected that. We said we need bold demands and we need what we call a fighting approach, which just means kind of organizing people and pressuring the people who can actually make the decisions. In this case, students kind of throwing out that rule book around statesmanship or how you're supposed to engage politically and just going with, what do students need? We need more mental health, we need more counselors in schools, we need smaller class sizes, and making those demands on the elected officials. And then it's the job of the elected officials to figure out there's no money in Seattle, the richest city one of the richest cities in the history of the world, with billionaires literally just a stone's throw away. That's absurd, and students can see that.
This kind of movement-building approach is what Bernie and the squad have failed to use in Congress. Instead, they've tried to cut deals with Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi behind closed doors. The consequence has been no serious victories won. But on top of that, the betrayals by so-called left Democrats can have the effect of pushing working and young people out of political activism entirely, and also creates an increased opening for right-wing ideas. The Seattle Democrats' refusal to use these funds for mental health services, as they're legally meant for, is far from an isolated instance of their betrayals of the needs of our communities. It's happening at the same time that the Seattle School Board, also run by Democrats, is threatening a mass shuttering of 20 schools, nearly a third of all elementary schools in the city.
I looked at the list, and it's mostly elementary schools that are in low-income neighborhoods.
Yeah.
In Brown and, personally, one of them was the elementary school that I went to. And it's literally in the center of, where all the brown and black kids live. And so it's just really disheartening. I think it's just going to have to be a continued, fight towards it. If there's no active push for them to not be closed, I think it'll be a quiet sweep of schools just being shut down. So yeah, again, it'll just have to be actions.
Yeah, we need a big hell.
Yeah.
And the dire underfunding of public education needs are hardly unique to Seattle. In Washington state, Democrats have controlled the governor's mansion for 30 out of the last 30 years, the state Senate for 20 years, and the state House for 23 years. Democrats have controlled all 3 centers of government for 15 of those 30 years, and at least 2 of the 3 for 28 out of the last 30 years. Despite this, public education has remained criminally underfunded for decades. Literally criminal in the sense that they are actually breaking state law. As we know, the law and the courts under capitalism are mainly used against working people and the poor, and very rarely in our defense. Whereas the political establishment all too often gets away with ignoring the law when it doesn't serve their interests. Instead of fully funding education, both Democrats and Republicans have ensured that Washington state has the nation's most regressive tax system, with the wealthiest paying the least. This is especially striking, with Washington ranking among the top 10 states with the most billionaires. In 2013, Washington state's Democratic establishment, along with Republicans, gave the Boeing Corporation a nearly $9 billion handout, while at the same time telling working and poor people that there was no money for public schools, affordable housing, or decent health care.
Nationally, various studies have shown that public schools are underfunded to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. As the American Federation of Teachers has reported, quote, school funding in most states fell off a fiscal cliff 15 years ago and never got back up, end quote. And not surprisingly, Black students are 3 times more likely than white students to live in chronically underfunded school districts. This deep and long-standing public school funding crisis only exacerbates the mental health crisis that is exploding in society under capitalism, especially hitting young people hard. For young people of all genders, 12 through 17 years of age, the rate of depression has more than doubled since 2012. The number of drug overdoses among adolescents nearly tripled between 2018 and 2022. According to the Centers for Disease Control, 42% of high school students reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness in 2021. Among girls, the rate is 57%. Among LGBTQ youth, the rate is nearly 70%. As Kaylin mentioned at the start of the show, a shocking 1 out of 10 high schoolers attempted suicide in 2021 alone. Across the board, youth mental health issues and their consequences, depression, drug overdose, suicidal thoughts, and suicide have increased dramatically over the last decade. The lives of young people in America are also increasingly being damaged by the prevalence of gun violence. Both gun-based assault and gun-based suicide has risen among youth. The Washington Post has reported a sharp increase in school shootings. According to their data, the last 3 years have been the worst 3 years on record for the number of school shootings, followed by 2018 and 2019. 66% of youth firearm deaths are from assault, 27% from suicide, 5% accidental. The upward trend in firearm-related deaths is particularly dramatic among Black youth, whose rate of these deaths has more than doubled in just 4 years between 2018 and 2022.
It's impossible to understand the crises facing young people without recognizing that it's rooted in the capitalist system itself. Many cite the COVID-19 lockdown as the primary factor in the deterioration of youth mental health. However, while staying at home and away from peers certainly did have an impact on increased isolation and social anxiety, this doesn't by itself account for the deep crisis so many young people are facing. The capitalist system is a driver of deep economic inequality and ensures low standards of living for the vast majority of working class and poor Americans, and even more so in many neo-colonial countries. It's a system owned and controlled by the billionaires, who, with the help of their political parties, in the US that's both the Democrats and the Republicans, and their institutions, get what they want. Meanwhile, they fight tooth and nail against any reforms that benefit working people and the poor, and try to snatch back the reforms that working people do succeed in winning through fighting mass movements. And of course, that's what they're doing right now with the Money Our People's Budget movement won for mental health counseling. The political establishment is attempting to take back that past victory by refusing to spend the money. Capitalism does not work for working people, and no amount of reforms can make it do so. Workers' real wages have been essentially stagnant since the 1970s, as big business has attacked unions and pushed austerity on working people. Working people are working more and more hours, and often multiple jobs. All the while, the number of billionaires has grown dramatically. All of this has resulted in younger generations growing up in an increasingly financially stressed home environment, and increasingly disillusioned and angry at this deeply unequal system. Despite what Joe Biden and the Democrats would like people to believe, workers' wages have not recovered from the COVID-triggered financial crisis either, which included months of rapid inflation, putting a massive strain on working families. To make matters much worse, Biden and the Democrats pulled the rug out from under working people by eliminating critical pandemic-era social programs, including letting the expansion of the child tax credit expire, causing child poverty to more than double. In addition to the financial struggles of their families, young people are faced with soaring college tuition and staring down the barrel of lifelong and crippling student loan debt. All of this with no guarantee of a good-paying job. The anger from this has helped create the space for the right wing to make gains, and potentially for dangerous billionaire Donald Trump to win the White House in November. We need an alternative to these two parties of the billionaires. Neither Biden nor Trump are any option for young people or working class people. We need a party of our own, and we need to support the strongest independent left candidate in this presidential election, Jill Stein, as a step towards that new party.
I think it's so important that we stand up together and not vote for Biden. I know that many people, every election we're told, this is the election to save our democracy. But the reality is that notion has brought rise to Trump, because if we're told every single election to just compromise, people at a certain point are going to get angry and turn to the extreme. And that's why we've seen Trump gain so much power. And so if we really want to beat Trump, we need a progressive candidate who is going to fight against the genocide in Gaza, who's going to fight for workers, who's going to fight for the working class and not compromise to big businesses. Or else we're just going to continue to see Trump or people like him rise to power every couple of years. And so we've at some point need to finally stand up. He's creating a genocide. And so I would say Genocide Joe is someone that I cannot vote for.
It is important to make it concrete with ordinary people, with young people, with working people, that we do have other options that are concrete, that it does matter if you vote for Jill Stein, along with, is it 100,000? Is it a million? Is it 5 million? It matters if a candidate that's a third party who overtly rejects, the two parties of big business, and in this case, two parties of genocidal war. It does matter if you can get, as big a number as possible organized around that candidate. And it's also an important way to kind of identify people who are willing to kind of, buck the common sense and take a vote for Jill Stein, and then potentially, go out and organize rallies or, ways to pressure city council members to fund public education. So it's a good way to kind of bring in people who are willing to fight, not just in the electoral situation, but in social movements as well.
Tens of millions of young people face the prospect of skyrocketing rent when they move out of their parents' homes, despite living with housemates and the knowledge that they'll likely never own a home of their own. So when young people look at their lives, it seems to be that they are expected to work hard in school so that they can get a job, and work hard so they can never get a decent standard of living and quality of life, little free time and relaxation, never be able to retire, and work almost until they die. On top of this, young people's entire lives have been dominated by the exponential acceleration of climate catastrophe and the accelerating horrors of capitalist wars. From the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to the war in Ukraine, and now the ongoing genocidal war on Gaza. With global capitalism and the new Cold War era, wars are increasingly on the horizon, driven by the rising imperialist conflict between the US and China-led blocs. Meanwhile, social media companies like Meta push deeply harmful content on young people in the name of profits. We saw in a horrifying Wall Street Journal report that Instagram routinely recommends sexual content to users as young as 13 years old. And companies like X, formerly known as Twitter, and their billionaire owners have actively boosted the reach of right-wing ideas. They do this to make a profit, but also to sow divisions among young people and working people and stir up hatred towards women, Black people, immigrants, and trans and queer youth. Working people and young people need to get organized, independently of the parties of the billionaires, the Democrats, and Republicans. That's how Kshama Sawant used her socialist city council office in Seattle, and that's why we launched Workers Strike Back. We need to fight for a real raise for working people, including a $25 an hour minimum wage. For good union jobs for all, we need to fight racism, sexism, transphobia, and all oppression. We need quality, affordable housing, and free healthcare for all. And we need a new party for working and young people. These are Workers Strike Back's demands. We also need to fight for the public democratic ownership of the healthcare system, of the big energy companies, of the banks, because we can't control what we don't own, and we need a fundamentally different kind of society and an end to capitalism itself. Capitalism is a system that enriches the billionaires at the expense of everyone else and of the planet. It is their system, not ours. They get rich by keeping most of the wealth that working people create. Capitalism is the root of many crises that working and young people face every day. The mental health crisis, the affordable housing crisis, the gun violence epidemic, the climate crisis, as well as the spiral of war, including the genocidal war on Gaza. So we need to build movements that fight in the here and now for bold demands and concrete gains. But we need to tie that fight with the struggle to end capitalism and for a socialist world.
We want the people who make those decisions about where the money goes and how the needs are met. We want those people to be like the 80% who support Medicare for all. Or you go in the schools, you can't find a single adult or young person who wouldn't say yes to the need for more mental health counselors and who wouldn't think it's just absurd that we can't have billionaires paying more. And those are the ordinary people need to be in charge of making these decisions that relate to our needs, as opposed to what we've got now, which is a billionaire class that is just making money hand over fist, and elected representatives like the Democrats on the city council who maybe talk a certain good talk every so often, but when it comes to actually taxing and then being able to fund basic needs, I mean, you just have to. They're unwilling to do that.
Young people have, in many ways, borne the brunt of the capitalist crisis, but they've also been beginning to fight back. The climate movement, the George Floyd uprising, the Starbucks and Amazon union movements, young workers involved in strike actions, and now the movement to end the war on Gaza, youth have been the driving force. Support amongst Americans for the genocidal war on Gaza has collapsed. Only 36% of Americans support the U.S. sending military aid to Israel to fund the war. Among young people aged 18 to 29, support for the U.S. military funding is far lower at just 16%. Across the board, young people are rejecting what capitalism has on offer and are looking for ways to get organized. Workers and young people around the country also need to stand alongside each other in our struggles.
But in the end, the only way that we're going to solve every single issue, we're going to solve the climate crisis, we're going to give women abortion rights, we're going to stop the genocide in Gaza, is by having a big movement to really force the system as a whole to change. It can't just be small little changes on its own. That is really good, and I'm really proud of the Seattle Student Union, the work we do. But really, we're educating young people so that we can build a movement and hopefully at a certain time completely gut the entire system and change everything so that before our planet gets set on fire.
Yeah.
In order to win any major victory, and especially something like ending the war on Gaza, which faces such fierce opposition from the entire political establishment, we need to build our own organizations and movements, independent of the two parties of big business. Young people clearly recognize this need. In the 2024 presidential election, young people are rejecting both options on offer from the two capitalist parties, with barely half of young voters currently saying they plan to vote for either Trump or Biden in November. This is an important development, but it's not enough to simply not vote for either pro-war big business candidate. Workers and young people need to act in an organized way to strike the biggest possible blow to the political establishment and start building an alternative. That's why Workers Strike Back is organizing to build the biggest possible vote in November against both Biden and Trump and for the strongest independent left challenger, Jill Stein, who is running a pro-worker, anti-war campaign as a Green Party candidate. As an important next step, we need to mobilize for mass protests at the DNC in August, including the Workers Strike Back rally on August 20th at 6 p.m., where Jill Stein will be speaking, and which we will broadcast live. The protests at the DNC itself should be backed up with coordinated protests in cities across the country on August 19th, the first day of the Democratic National Convention. If you're interested in attending or helping to organize a protest in your city, or in attending Workers Strike Back's rally in Chicago on August 20th, go to workersstrikeback.org/events and fill out the registration form. We'll be updating our website regularly as more events are confirmed, so keep checking back if you don't see anything in your area. Also, be sure to register for the July 21st Workers Strike Back National Zoom meeting, where we'll be preparing for these protests and getting more organized to take the movement forward over the next few months and beyond. Because this fight doesn't end in November. Regardless of who ends up in the White House, workers and young people need to urgently build the fight back against the war on Gaza, attacks on queer and abortion rights, the cost of living crisis, the youth mental health crisis, the climate crisis, and all the crises of capitalism that will continue to worsen under either Biden or Trump. We urgently need to lay the groundwork to build a new party for working people to fight for our demands.
If you've watched On Strike before, you'll know we provide an analysis from the point of view of working class people about the problems we face in our daily lives under capitalism. In every episode, On Strike also presents a strategy for working class movements to fight back and win. On Strike talks about why it's critical that every fight for change emphasizes the need to build working class solidarity and is linked with organizing a powerful challenge to the political establishment and the capitalist system itself. This is something you won't find on mainstream media. That's why we need your support for On Strike. Subscribe to On Strike channel on YouTube and like this video, and become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to organize to rebuild a fighting labor movement. By becoming a member of Workers Strike Back, you can also help this broadcast. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations for working people. Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. Solidarity.